There is a lot of information and resources available for weight training. When first starting out, it can be confusing to navigate all this information and know what you should really be doing in the gym. This video will cover all the fundamental concepts of weight training that you need to know to get started as a beginner. The first thing to consider is, what is your training goal? Why are you in the gym in the first place? This is important to consider because your training routine should reflect what your goals are. There are two primary goals that lifting aims to achieve: building muscle mass or getting stronger. Muscle growth, as the name implies, refers to increasing the size of your muscles. People may want to achieve this for aesthetic purposes or simply to improve long-term health and function. Strength, on the other hand, refers to the ability to lift more weight. This is generally the goal for competitive strength athletes like powerlifters and weightlifters, but anyone can aim to increase strength if they want. Almost any form of weight training will result in some amount of muscle growth and strength gains, but your training program can be set up in a way to prioritize one over the other. But as a beginner, you are probably better off focusing mostly on training for muscle growth, since it takes time to develop the coordination to be able to lift heavy loads under control with free weight compound lifts as is required for strength training. So throughout this video, we will discuss how to train for muscle growth rather than strength. And you will always be able to prioritize strength later in your lifting career if that is something you want to do. Now, to actually get started with your training, it is best to have a training program that you follow. It isn't mandatory, but it gives you a plan to follow so that you know what you are going to do in the gym rather than winging it each workout. To create a training program, there are a few things we need to consider. How many times per week will you lift? What muscle groups will be trained on each day? What exercises will you do each workout? How many sets of each exercise will you perform? And how many reps should you do? Let's now cover each of these variables. The first consideration is how often you will train at the gym. Training more often will generally result in a faster rate of muscle growth, as it allows you to accumulate a greater total amount of training. But in the real world, the number of times you lift per week is mostly a matter of practicality and personal preference. If you are a super busy person with lots of responsibilities, or lifting is not a super high priority to you, then you might decide to lift fewer sessions per week. Whereas if you have lots of time and energy to train, then you might decide to lift more sessions per week. When first starting out, you don't need to do too much training to see significant results, so you don't need to stress too much about it. You are better off sticking with a routine that you can consistently adhere to rather than trying to do too much and stopping altogether. So choose something that is realistic and sustainable for you. In most cases, training 2 to 4 times per week is a good starting point for beginners. Throughout this video, we will create an example training program. In this example program, let's say we will train 3 times per week on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, leaving the other days as rest days. Next, we need to establish what training split we will follow. This refers to what muscle groups will be trained on which days. There are 10 main muscle groups we generally try to target in the gym. These are the chest, back, shoulders, biceps, triceps, quadriceps, hamstrings, glutes, calves, and abdominals. You don't necessarily need to train all these muscle groups in your routine, and you could prioritize some more than others. Furthermore, some exercises will train multiple muscle groups simultaneously. So what training split should we follow? Well, the exact training split isn't all that important in the grand scheme of things, so again, it isn't really something to stress too much about. However, there are a few considerations to be aware of. First is that you usually want to let a muscle group rest at least 48 hours before training it again. So in most cases, you want your training split to avoid training the same muscle groups on back-to-back days. Second is that it is sometimes helpful to pair muscle groups that work together, known as synergistic muscles, on the same days. For example, the biceps are usually worked during back training and the triceps are usually worked during chest training. So if an accessory muscle is already being trained to some extent, it can be a good idea to train it directly in the same workout. And third is that you would ideally want to try and train the same muscle group at least twice per week if it is viable. It is certainly not mandatory, but it would be a little better to evenly distribute the total workload for a muscle group between 2 or more days per week rather than doing all the work in a single session. For example, our 3-day training routine could follow a push-pull leg split, training each muscle group only once per week. Or we could redistribute this for a more full body workout each session, since there will be at least one complete rest day between workouts. This split trains most muscle groups 2 times per week. Moving forward, let's go with this full body style training split. The next consideration is what exercises will be performed on each of these days. Because we have our training split established, we basically just need to pick exercises that train those muscle groups. It might take some time to learn which exercises train which muscles based on their anatomical structure, but I will link a playlist that covers how to train each muscle group in the description. Besides this, other considerations for exercise selection are the use of free weights versus machines and compound versus isolation lifts. As a beginner, I would say to implement the exercises that you feel confident performing and that you can perform safely. In most cases, this will include mostly machine-based lifts which are naturally very stable and easy to perform. And as you develop more skill and coordination over time, you can expand the pool of exercises you can perform for each muscle group. In our example program, here are the exercises I have chosen. Most of them are stable exercises which are simple and easy to perform, but still train the muscle groups we are targeting. Next, we will need to prescribe how many sets will be performed for each exercise. In general, performing more sets produces a faster rate of muscle growth over time. However, this also takes more time and effort to perform, so we can't just perform an infinite number of sets for each exercise. As a beginner, any amount of training will be sufficient to build muscle mass, so it isn't vital to train with a very high number of sets. To keep things simple, performing 2 to 4 sets per exercise is a good general starting point. And if you have the time and energy, you could increase this over time for muscle groups that you want to prioritize. In our example training program, we will just stick with performing 3 sets for each exercise. Next, we need to establish how many reps we should perform for each set. In reality, equivalent muscle growth can be achieved by training anywhere within the approximate 5 to 20 rep range. There may be times where it is more appropriate to lift within the lower end of this range, and other times in the higher end. But as a beginner, to keep things simple, I'd recommend to start by sticking to the 8 to 12 rep range. This puts you in a moderate zone, which is going to provide you with a good hypertrophic stimulus, it is heavy enough to promote strength gains, and it allows you to practice and develop your technique without a high injury risk. In our example program, I have prescribed 8 to 12 reps for all exercises. We will touch more on this in the progressive overload section later in the video. Next is rest periods. So the question is, how long should you rest between sets? There isn't really an ideal length of time you need to rest between sets. You can achieve great results with shorter rest periods as well as longer rest periods. Similar to rep ranges, slightly shorter or longer rest periods might be selected in different scenarios, but you don't really need to worry too much about this as a beginner. To keep things simple, just rest roughly 1 to 2 minutes between sets. You can either time this with a stopwatch, or you can just roughly gauge this without a timer and just perform the next set once you feel ready. Either way is fine, it isn't going to make a major difference to your results. So for our example training program, let's implement 1.5 minutes rest between sets for each exercise. Now that we have the basic program created, we now need to discuss how to execute it in the gym. Most of the information is already on the program, but there are a few additional things that need to be addressed. The first of which is lifting technique. This isn't a variable that we can prescribe on a program, but it is an important factor. It takes time and experience to develop effective lifting technique over time, and your technique can become more individualized over time as you gain more and more experience. However, when first starting out, you just need to keep the basics in mind. Here are the main technique considerations when performing your exercises. Avoid using too much external momentum to help you lift the weight. Instead, try to make the majority of the movement only occur at the joints which are directly involved in the lift. For example, avoid movement from the hips and torso when performing a bicep curl. Try to keep the movement occurring primarily from the elbows. Second is to control the lowering phase of the lift. Don't let the weight fall under the forces of gravity. Instead, make sure you are actively controlling the weight all the way down. For example, we don't want to quickly drop the weight during a leg extension. Control the weight all the way down from the top position to the bottom. And third is to train with a full range of motion. Avoid cutting the range of motion short by skipping either the start position or the end. Instead, make sure to lift all the way up and all the way down. For example, we don't want to go only halfway down during a bench press. Instead, you want to touch the chest with every rep. The next question is, what weight should we use? Well, the weight used is basically a result of the previous factors we have discussed. Based on the number of reps performed, rest periods, and technique, the load you use will be determined. Most notably, the reps you perform will influence load the most. Lifting a heavier load means you can't perform as many reps, while lifting a lighter load means you are able to perform more reps. So if your rep target is predetermined, you need to find a weight that allows you to lift within that range. In our example, we have selected the 8 to 12 rep range as our target. So select a weight that allows you to perform 8 to 12 reps for 3 sets. If you can complete 3 sets of 12 easily, then you probably need to go up in weight. But if you can't complete at least 3 sets of 8 reps, then you probably need to lower the weight. We want to select a weight that allows us to stick to the target rep range, but is somewhat challenging. By the last set, it should be fairly difficult to get to the target rep range, but still doable. Finding this sweet spot might initially take some time, but a little trial and error is necessary. And it is also important to keep in mind that you want to be able to complete these reps while maintaining effective technique. If you find that you are breaking form just to meet the target rep range, then you are better off lowering the weight and lifting with strict technique. Lastly, let's discuss the concepts of logbooking and progressive overload. Logbooking is when we record what we did each workout so that we know what exercises, sets, reps, and weight we used. While it isn't mandatory to logbook your workouts, it helps us know what we did so that we can see how we are progressing over time. Which leads us to the concept of progressive overload. This is the idea of making training more challenging over time. As we build muscle and strength over time, a more challenging stimulus is required to promote further adaptation. If we were to complete the exact same training routine with the same reps and load forever, we would fail to continue building muscle and strength over time. But how should we implement progressive overload in the gym? There are many ways to apply progressive overload, but the primary way in which this will be achieved is via an increase in reps and load over time. Basically, we want to increase the number of reps we can perform with a given load, or increase the load we can lift for a given number of reps. As a beginner, progression will occur quite fast, usually being able to increase reps or load every time you repeat the same workout. This will slow down over time, and the way progressive overload is applied will differ slightly, but as a beginner, things will progress quite quickly. So how do we know when to increase reps or load for an exercise? Well, this is going to be based on the performance of previous workouts, which is why logbooking is important. Here is a simple progression strategy that will work well for beginners. If you can complete all sets at the top of the prescribed rep range, then increase the weight the next time you perform that same workout. But if you can't complete all sets at the top of the rep range, then stick with the same weight and try to increase the number of reps you perform. As an example, let's say we were to perform the leg press for 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps with 1.5 minutes of rest. In the first week, this lifter can complete all 3 sets for 12 reps with 50 kilograms. Because they hit the top of the rep range with all sets, the next week they can increase the weight to 55 kilograms. Let's say they were also able to complete all 3 sets for 12 reps, so they increase the weight again to 60 kilograms in the following week. This time they were able to complete 12 reps for the first 2 sets, but only 10 reps for the last set. So in week 4, they keep the same load, but this time manage to achieve 12 reps for all sets. So in week 5, load is increased to 65 kilograms, and reps achieved were 12, 10, 8 for each set respectively. In week 6, the same load is used, but more total reps were performed, being 12, 11, 10. And this same pattern would continue by increasing reps until the top of the range is achieved and load is increased. It should also be noted that progressive overload should only be applied while maintaining strict and effective technique. If you add reps or load at the expense of technique, it isn't really true progression. And if you feel that your form is suffering, don't be afraid to reduce load or reps. You will usually achieve a better muscle growth stimulus by lifting with effective technique and less load than increasing load and sacrificing technique. Let's now summarize all the information we have discussed. Resistance training will achieve two primary goals: muscle growth and strength gains. Any form of resistance training will achieve both goals, but beginners should usually emphasize muscle growth initially. To set up a training program, here are the primary variables to consider. The number of days to lift per week should be something that you can realistically adhere to for an extended period of time. Your training split isn't all that important, but try to train high priority muscles at least 2 times per week and try to avoid training the same muscle group on back-to-back days. Train the muscle group you are trying to target with exercises that you feel safe and confident performing. Doing more sets is usually going to be more beneficial for muscle growth, but to start out, 2 to 4 sets for each exercise will be sufficient. You can technically train anywhere within the approximate 5 to 20 rep range, but sticking with moderate rep ranges of around 8 to 12 is simple and easy to follow starting out. And resting around 1 to 2 minutes between sets is adequate in most cases. In terms of lifting in the gym, there are a few additional factors to consider. First is that it is important to maintain strict and effective technique. Use a weight that allows you to lift within your target rep range while maintaining technique and that allows the exercise to be fairly challenging. It is also good practice to logbook your workouts by recording the reps and load you used each workout. This helps to apply progressive overload. To apply progressive overload, add reps and load over time to continue providing an effective training stimulus. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.